All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Evernest Real Estate Investor Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Spencer Sutton, and today I'm flying solo. I don't have Matthew Whitaker. I don't have Gray Hall, but I'm actually really excited and kind of glad that they're not here because I get to share this episode with two of my colleagues, two of my Denver colleagues. So
nice.
yeah,
Yes.
Welcome, ladies. I have Debbie Bretner and I have Christine Balin. Ladies, welcome to the show.
Thanks.
you.
We're very excited to be here.
Yes,
Yeah.
very happy to be here.
Well, I'm excited because we've not had an episode where we've discussed Denver. And I'm using Denver kind of lightly because even before we got on here, we were just talking about, our footprint in I guess what you all would call the front range of Colorado.
Right.
Is that it?
All
Yep.
across Front Range.
So we're talking like all the way up north, Fort Collins to Boulder to Denver, all the way down to Colorado Springs. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
Yes.
So that's what we're going to be talking about, probably with an emphasis on Denver. But we manage, I would say this market is our second largest market. We manage somewhere over 800 properties. And these properties are a mix with like investors own them, as well as what we consider just homeowners or accidental landlords. So it's a great mix of owners all up and down the Front Range. And you all are the experts. So I'm here to learn from you all. So why don't you do this? Why don't the two of you kind of introduce yourselves? What do you do with us? And then I'll just start diving in with some questions. So
Sure.
Debbie,
Christine,
go
why
ahead.
don't
You
you go
kick it
first?
off.
Oh, sounds good. Debbie Bretner, and I've been with Evernest actually a short period of time, just since January. Came in from an acquisition, came in as a property manager, and now moving into business development. So I'm super excited to be hitting this market just purely for business development. It's a growing market, a lot of opportunity. And Christine and I and another BDM, we're just going to hit the ground running.
So Debbie, how long have you been in real estate in the area, in the Denver area? Because before you were with a different company.
Right. So about almost 7 years.
Okay. Awesome. So you've seen a huge boom.
Huge boom. Yes.
Huge boom. Awesome. All right, Christine.
So just about the same time frame. So in 2014, I got my real estate license, and I accidentally became a property manager after a couple of years. And then I have been through the very first acquisition for Denver when I was actually working at the company that they acquired. And I have been with the company now since the beginning of 2019. I have played a variety of roles among the company, both doing BDM, helping support the property managers, doing stuff in the field. I've also been a showing agent for our, new prospects and tenants. And I last year became the listing broker and the investor broker for Colorado. So I now do sales for us on the real estate side.
That's awesome. So between the two of you, Debbie and Christine, we have tons of experience in this market. And that's what I want to draw on from you all, just because our listeners, what I think is really interesting is because we're in so many different markets, we have people who are listening who are invested in areas like Chattanooga or Little Rock, and some who are invested in Nashville or Detroit. And what the feedback that we're getting is people love to even hear what's going on in different markets, right? So even if they're investing in like Birmingham, they love to hear what's happening in Denver or Detroit or something like that. So I'm going to try to pull some of this out of you today, just with some questions. And I know you guys are going to do great. So I guess the first thing that I would be thinking, because I know Denver, high appreciation over the past several years.
Yeah.
I think it's perceived in the US as being a really expensive market, but tell us, or tell our listeners, why is Denver a great place to own rental property? I'd love to hear that.
Well, you nailed it. It's a very strong market, and it is growing, and the influx of people coming into Denver, it's not stopping. Businesses are coming here. And so, the lack of housing is a big thing. There's a strong demand, very little supply. So that rental market is extremely, extremely strong. It's happening on the rental side. And Christine, you can, mirror this, that real estate and leasing mirror each other. How that market is flexing really does mirror each other.
So what you're saying is, like, there's demand for rental housing, right? So you have a demand from potential residents, but just not enough houses.
Right.
And so investors are coming in and saying, hey, we see an opportunity to if we can buy some properties, we'll have them rented year round. Cause I know we rent houses super fast.
We do.
Yes.
And there's such a shortage. Like I said, people are moving in, houses are selling fast. And what happens in the rental market, as soon as you sell a house, let's just say it's the best time to sell. I'm going to get top dollar. Then they try to buy and they can't buy because the competition on the real estate side is so high. They fall into my rental market. And so they're now my renters and they weren't meant to be. And so the caliber of people in the rental market is high, very high pricing properties, and high quality renters are really, at least in the Denver market, that is what I'm seeing.
Yes, I can attest to that. I still do some showings on occasion, and it's a lot of people who are selling to cash in on their investment. They bought, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and they're selling, but it's very hard to then get into another property. So they're out there looking for a rental. They're using their money in that way. And so it's making it very hard for renters. But on the landlord side, on the investor side, it's great to keep your properties filled.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like when we were just in Birmingham, we always waited until a resident moved out of the house. Then we did our walkthrough. Then we cleaned it up, and then we were telling our owners, we are not putting this house on the market until the property's ready because you'll lose people. But it's not
Absolutely
that way
not.
in Denver. It's not that way in Nashville. Like people are ready to see it before the resident even moves out. That's how
sight
strong the demand
unseen,
is.
even
sight unseen. That
sight
is huge
unseen?
in this Denver. Sight unseen, huge in this Denver market. I'm renting right now, and I literally just had to do the same thing. I just am signing a lease sight unseen. But I know the market, I know the neighborhood because I've lived here long enough. So I know the quality, but that's how competitive it is.
Yeah. So what are people like? What are people buying when they come? I'm thinking about the investor. If there's such low inventory and such high competition for these properties, like how are investors getting in the market, Christine?
So I think a big thing that is happening right now is a lot of pocket deals, a lot of agents that know each other, that know that they have investors that they're working with. We're networking a lot right now. And I'm about to go under contract probably by the end of the day with another pocket deal. If there are any type of distressed properties that owners don't want to deal with before selling, wholesalers are just calling constantly, texting everything. I get a new email or text every day just about. And then I'm even seeing institutional investors getting involved, even in the Denver suburb market. I just had a listing a few weeks ago, and one of the offers was a cash offer by an investment company that was wanting to just turn it into a rental. So that is happening here, even though it is hard to edge your way in. So it's actually just making it really hard for first-time home buyers.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. The competition. So if you're a first-time home buyer and you're trying to qualify for a loan and you're up against making an offer against an institutional investor that's going to offer cash, same price, you're going to lose almost every single time. Right.
Right.
You may, though. It depends on that seller.
Well, tell me, like, I'm interested in the institutional, because that's just really blows my mind, because the institutions that I've typically come to know have been really interested in these tertiary markets. Right. So the tertiary markets are the Little Rocks and the Chattanoogas and the Birminghams. Obviously, they've been in Atlanta, but I think Atlanta has a good mix of both. They have super high end and some lower end stuff, but Denver doesn't really have lower end. So what are, like you mentioned, this institutional investor making a cash offer? What's the price point? What are the price points that we're seeing them buy in?
I mean, that one was a 535. They offered 575 for it. And they were willing to go higher. I mean, it was a turnkey 4-bed, 3-bath in Brighton. And which is about a half an hour outside of the Denver metro area. But that's an area that has really been blowing up. Not just specific to that. There's a lot of areas that are about a half an hour outside of Denver metro that are all just, getting these single family homes. They're entering that market here, and they just want to get in, because the longer you wait, the higher the prices are going. And I think that's what they're realizing, is that it's not gonna dip because the inventory isn't dipping. That's interest rates are slowing things slightly.
Right.
But
but you still have an influx of people, right? You still have people coming into the city, into the whole front range.
Those reasons aren't changing. People are still moving here for all the same reasons, and they can't keep up. I mean, we just lost 1,000 properties in a fire in the Denver metro area. So, they're having to exponentially catch up now.
Yeah. So what would that property, Debbie, probably rent for, the one that Christine just described? If you were just
say
like
4.2, 4.3, what was it, Christine?
4.3, about 2,500 square feet up in Brighton.
But how old's the property?
2014. Pretty new.
So you're probably, even Brighton, probably 26 to 28.95.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's so Denver in itself, I would say on an average, 2,600 is the rents. Unless you're doing multifamily, that's its gig. But the single families, even like the 3.2s, they are now, what used to be, 1,800 is easily 2,395 and higher.
It's hard to find a good, like 2-bed, 2-bath, even an apartment for less than 2K.
Yes.
Yeah. So what's the small multifamily scene like in the Denver area?
Debbie, I'll let you take that one.
So are you when you say multifamily, are we doing duplexes?
Yeah, well, I'm just thinking if there's not enough houses, are there does Denver allow new construction on multifamily? Are they allowing a lot of that?
There's actually a ton of that happening out in Green Valley Ranch, out by the airport. I just went out there, and I hadn't been out there in a few months, and there's just 10 new huge buildings of multifamily apartments.
Gotcha. Interesting.
Yeah, so it is booming, and that's a competition for us, right? So it's a competition for our owners that have their condos. So condos and apartments compete in this market. Apartments, of course, are newer. They have amenities. So, when we have investors looking in condos, I personally don't advise condos. It's just a harder turnaround. HOAs are tough to work with because you are competing with the apartments. Barnum is a big place. Christine, I don't know if you've seen some increase in Barnum. That's a big turnaround. Commerce City. And these are all little suburbs of Denver, and it's popping up. And my guess is there'll be conversion to condos in that 7 to 10 years. That's the incentive with builders right now. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But when COVID hit, kind of the apartments almost stopped, and the influx to single family homes increased because of spacing. And that played a huge role in the rental market and the buy and sell market.
So that kind of what I'm thinking is it kind of pushed people out of downtown Denver area, out of the city center, because they're like, hey, I can work from the house, but I need more space. So I'm going to live out in the suburbs.
Right. And it happened, but now that it's slowly coming back to normalcy, people want to go back into Denver, to the restaurants, to the sportings. So people are starting to go back into the Denver market for sure, in multifamily in all levels.
Yes, but I have seen some huge sort of, I guess, exodus to northern parts of Denver, or not even Denver, Longmont, which kind of sits between Denver and Fort Collins. I had personal friends that moved from Aurora and moved up there to have just a better experience in life. Space, exactly. And then also like Parker is a booming area in the southern part of Denver metro. I sold like 4 houses down there last year. That's also new builds have become super popular with both buyers and then also investors, because by the time they're built, all that they've actually grown equity even by the time they get into the house.
Sure. Yeah. So if it's like a 6-month build or whatever, then they've they've got 6 months of appreciation from what they
Right.
locked in at.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
really
And there's, oh, sorry, go on, Spencer.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, and another incentive that's happening, and this is something we can address later, but Denver as a whole is starting to put regulations on rentals, and you have to register your rental. And that's a whole other conversation. But one exempt is if it's a new build, they have up to 4 years that they do not have to register or do an inspection. So investors are like, let me ride this out a little bit. Let me look at new builds. And it's a way to get into the market without some of this red tape now that is occurring in the city, actually in the county.
And so for the county, what you're saying is even now, if you're an experienced landlord, you've been there for a number of years, you're now having to register your rental, have city inspections before you can rent it out for each new resident. Is that correct?
Well, it's a 3-year license or 4 years, Christine.
It's a 3-year license. It's not per tenant. It is just a period of time.
Okay.
It's rather affordable. It's just, I think they need to start regulating it because it kind of got a little out of control there for a minute.
Well, then that leads into another conversation. And I don't know if either one of you have a lot of experience with this, since we don't do short-term rental, but I'd love to kind of hear what's Denver's stance on short-term rentals, because everybody loves a good Airbnb story. So what's going on in Denver with short-term rentals?
Short-term rentals are happening, but each county is getting very strict on it. And it's getting harder to do short-term rentals. I would say in the suburbs, it's virtually impossible, anything less than 6 months. The city itself, because what's happening is it takes away from hotels, and there's incentives for the hotels to be in the city. So the city's coming down harder and harder on these short-term rentals. People are kind of doing it on the side. So it's a struggle.
It's become pretty popular to try to find a duplex where you can live in one side of it and rent the other one out. That's kind of how people are getting by. That I actually just sold one last month. That is their game plan once the tenant downstairs moves out, to turn the downstairs into, they'll live upstairs and then they'll have downstairs as their short-term rental. But
is that one of the exemptions?
Yeah,
maybe it is. Yeah,
it is. But you do have to get proper licensing, and that's in Denver proper.
So tell me, let's talk about what kind of deals are happening in the Denver market, because it is so hot. I mean, I know we've talked a little bit about the competition, but if I'm an investor and I've really thought about, hey, Denver, what I think is really interesting. We had a person there in Denver, a guy named Chris Lopez. We interviewed him back in 2019. Things were booming in 2019, and Matthew and I sat down with Chris, and we were like, tell us, is the Denver market in a bubble? And he went through all this information, was like, no. At the end of the day, the Denver market is not in a bubble. And we were like, okay, man, we take your word for it. And he was right.
Yeah.
So we're saying, maybe the interest rates are going to soften the market a little bit, maybe, but there's still so much demand. So what kind of deals are happening, and how can people get involved in them?
Well, you've got to come ready to play. If you're going to get into a property here, you've got to come ready. If you're doing lending, that isn't a deal breaker. You don't just need cash. But if you are doing lending, you have to expect to do an appraisal gap coverage. That is something that is going to come up, and that is what every seller is looking for, because properties are increasing so quickly that you're having to kind of offer well over ask. So kind of anticipate that. But then once you get there, your appraisal doesn't always match up, but quite frankly, within about 6 months, it usually catches back up to what you paid for. The other piece that's with the way you're getting into properties here is the inspection. Do not expect any type of cosmetic repairs, none whatsoever. If it does have to do with health and safety, a lot of deals are being written that way. If you've got a sewer line that needs replaced, or, HVAC system needing replaced, or a roof fixed, but luckily there has been a lot of hail. And the reason I say luckily is that a lot of roofs have been replaced slashed with insurance claims
Right.
in the last 5 years. So those are all things that you just need to expect going into it. But there's lots of deals happening. So it's just, you've got to come ready to play.
Let me ask this. So Debbie, you and I were talking before we even hit record. We were talking earlier about just how many accidental landlords that we bring into our portfolio. These are people that for whatever reason,
they know there's appreciation. They don't want to let it go.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. Are they accidental landlords because it's really accidental? They can't sell it, or are they accidental because, I wasn't really thinking I was going to be an investor, but I'm definitely going to hold on to this house.
I think both.
Okay.
I think a lot of people are moving, right? And so because there's a job, a lot of my accidental landlords, they just got a job. So, they're too afraid to sell their house because can they buy in the market if they want to move back here? They have family here. So they're like, okay, we're going to move out and let's just try this for a while. And then some of them like, wow, my house appreciated so much. I can take money out of this house and actually maybe get another home because they're in a good position. And so they start to build accidentally, getting one or two properties. And those are probably the two biggest in the Denver market itself. And that's, and then they don't know what they're doing. And they're like, oh my God, I don't even know how to do this. And with regulations, it's really an educational tool. When I'm talking to these accidental landlords, it's like kind of what we can do to help you and to be careful, that they're doing it right.
Correct. Yeah. That's the big thing. That is the big danger. Yeah. So if I'm sitting here and I'm a really aggressive investor, and what I would be thinking was, maybe I need to be reaching out to non-owner occupied, like landlords, like trying to find somebody who, they've had a good run, and maybe they maybe just don't like being a landlord. It was an accidental issue. But Christine, you're saying that wholesalers are already they're beating down the doors. They're texting, they're sending postcards, they're sending letters, they're calling, they're doing everything. Yeah. So that's how they're finding deals.
Yeah. But but to your point, I mean, if they are an accidental landlord and they're not owner occupied, and it's been a few years, they've appreciated a lot and they will make a lot. So, if you are making the right targeted calls, it could land you a deal. One of our tenants that I was showing the property to renters, she went over to the neighbor and, found that they were, either somebody passed away or they were preparing to sell, and she snuck in there and she purchased it. She's redoing the whole property. I mean, that's how deals are happening. You just have to continue to network and just be out there, be ready. I think that's the real key. But there's also some people there's also a big market for people living in their property, then growing out of it and retaining their old property and then buying another one, and they're building portfolios that way. We actually have a couple of landlords in our portfolio that built it that way. And now they're starting to unload some of those properties because they have, 10, and then they're like, oh, well, we can cash in a few of these, put it elsewhere. You
can
put
cash
it into
in
another,
a few and you can buy in a different market. You can diversify.
Right.
Do a 1031 exchange, all those things. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say that's a lot with our condos. I mean, condos, they grow out of it. Then they're like, okay, then they do the townhome, keep the condo. Then they grow to the townhome, keep the condo, the townhome, and get their single family. And that's the way a lot of I would say the younger investors are growing in this market.
Interesting.
And it's easier to keep those too. Less maintenance. The HOA is taking care of it, a lot of it for you. So, it kind of narrows your risk as well when you outgrow those properties and build your portfolio that way.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So we've talked a lot about Denver. Let's think about, because like we talked about, we're all up and down the Front Range. So let's talk about the difference between Fort Collins, which is north, and you all can tell me how far north it is. I just know it's north, and I know Boulder is a little bit maybe to the west of Fort Collins, southwest of Fort Collins. So we're in both of those markets, Fort Collins and Boulder. I would imagine even those two markets are vastly different because I know Boulder's its own little,
bubble.
That's
its
own
own
That's
bubble.
right. It is the bubble. I didn't want to say that because I've got a friend who lives there, but he is living in a bubble.
It's a good bubble.
That. Yeah, that's right. It's not a bad bubble to be in.
Yeah.
But Talk
ahead.
about the difference between the two. I'd love to just kind of learn more about Fort Collins and like compared to Denver. What's it like up there?
It's
Well, I would say the
definitely-
rental and the real estate are different. So Christine, why don't you talk about the real estate side?
The real estate side, it's vastly different. I mean, Boulder is a very big bubble. You really can't get into Boulder with less than like $1 million.
Yeah.
Unless you're getting a condo. But if you're getting a single family home, you really can't get up there with less than that. And it's also a very different community than Denver is versus Fort Collins. Fort Collins is very conservative. Boulder is very liberal, and Denver kind of meets in the middle. So it's just there's definitely specific people who are very wanting to focus on Boulder. Now Fort Collins, it's a big college town. So rentals in that aspect are great to do seasonally, as well as Boulder too, but very different students.
So what is in Fort Collins? What college is in Fort Collins?
CSU.
Okay, CSU, and then CU is in Boulder.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
But
and then you also have a college down in Colorado Springs and the Air Force. So there's
we're going to talk about Colorado Springs in a little bit. Yeah. So because I think this is really interesting because they are kind of just different cultures, I guess is what I would call it a little bit.
Fort Collins is like more of there's more like farmland up there. There's more things in that aspect. Just like Greeley is also part of our market, which is a little bit further to the east and much more farmland. There's a ton of farms over there. But Fort Collins is kind of like just a smaller version of Denver. A lot of people really like it and are gravitating up there. I actually sold several properties up there. Some investors cashing in on their properties after years of holding them, actually right at the start of COVID. So that was an interesting sale.
Yeah. Right at the beginning.
Yeah.
What
the other thing
about
Boulder?
market? Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say Boulder is also kind of a little Silicon Valley. And so that's why, I mean, as far as hot market corporations,
tons of tech,
there's
Google,
of tech. All right. So,
Microsoft.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the rentals again, so Fort Collins to Denver, Fort Collins, I'd say probably is the most reasonable as far as rents go. Boulder probably tops Denver. Depending on where you are, single family homes in Denver may, but because of that Silicon Valley, the type of people who are moving there, I would say condos are starting sometimes at $1 million. So the rental market, even the college, I have 2 kids at CU Boulder, and I am paying a lot of money monthly for tiny little nasty little apartments. So,
and it can't grow either because it's butt up against the mountains. So the flat irons, as we call them. So they can't grow very much, and then now the fires are causing more issues there. So that's a whole other,
dynamic. That's a whole other dynamic that's added to the issues, right?
Because now we have just people needing property because they lost theirs, and there's just nowhere to build. Yeah.
So then you go further south, obviously south of Denver. How far south of Denver is Colorado Springs? Like drives about an hour?
Hour and a half.
About an hour and a half. Okay. So talk to me about what it's like down there. I know we've got friends that live here in Birmingham that both graduated from the Air Force Academy, which is in Colorado Springs. I started a nonprofit back in 2008, and I, partnered up with several other nonprofits. They all had their headquarters in Colorado Springs, which I thought was very interesting. There's just a lot of like nonprofits there. So what's going on in Colorado Springs? Why is it, or is it different than the Denver market? And then let's talk about the real estate down there.
It's growing. A lot of people, it's very interesting. Denver and Colorado Springs used to be extremely separate. And it was like this vast land from Denver to Colorado Springs. And then Castle Pines started to grow. Then Castle Rock started to grow. That's still part of Denver. And then tiny little gap. And now those two are butting up against each other. That Colorado Springs is starting to become Denver. And so because you have such a large infrastructure for the Air Force Academy, you have a couple of universities down there. It is booming. Those prices are starting to match Denver. I don't know about the real estate side, at least on the rental side, I do know. And a lot of people were leaving Denver and moving farther south to Colorado Springs and then commuting up to the Denver Tech Center because of pricing. But that gap is quickly closing. But I would say more of the institutional investors are kind of on that extreme of Fort Collins and Colorado Springs because of affordability. And I think that gap is going to start to close as the towns are just merging or starting to merge.
Yeah, right. People are they're all the gaps are getting filled in there with growth.
Absolutely. There's even chatter about Colorado Springs exceeding the size of Denver by 2050, I believe it was. I don't know if I believe that, but there is a lot of commerce coming there as well. I actually, in the beginning of my real estate career back in, I want to say like 2015, I helped a couple of different people purchase down in the Springs, and it was because of that price gap. They couldn't really afford what they needed up here. They were willing to commute up here to, get into a house that had that fit their needs. Now I think that gap is narrowing quite a bit. So it's still more affordable, just like Fort Collins, same sort of thing. They're both about an hour and a half away, depending of where in Denver you are. And they're both a little more conservative than Denver. But those price gaps are quickly narrowing.
Yeah, really, really interesting. What else so our listeners are typically investors. What other what kinds of advice, what other kind of advice do you have to give them? So we've talked to them about, hey, if you want to buy in Denver, come prepared to close. Don't come in. You can't come in timid. You can't come in scared. Don't expect, have your financing lined up. You definitely need to be willing to make over ask offers. And then, I guess the last thing that I heard from you all would be, if you're not here, networking yourself. So if you're out of state investor, like we have institutions, we do have out of state, you need to be connected with somebody who knows the market, who has the inside track.
Absolutely.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah.
And honestly, having, as an investor, how important a team is. And, having a property management company, especially if you are not in state, is vital, because Colorado is a very different state, or evolving into a different state. We have a lot of legislation, and our goal is to protect you. And so, because if you're coming in as an out-of-stater, knowing what is happening in this state, the changes that are happening, is vital to be successful. And that's our whole goal, right? We want this to be a successful endeavor for you, and just being aligned and knowing what's going on is huge. And that network is important.
Absolutely. And having people that have been involved in the community and in this industry for some time is super important. Just as Debbie's mentioning, the legislation is changing constantly, and you really have to stay on top of it. Another thing too, if you were investing to flip in any reason, if you're going to do that, you have to do it right. You can't just come in and just flip a house. Those are the houses that you can come in and buy if you want something that's quote turnkey, but they'll end up overpricing them. And it's a kind of a botched job. Those are the properties you do see actually sit on the market. There aren't many, but that's when they do sit. You can't just put lipstick on a pig and sell it here.
Right.
Even though it is a crazy market, those properties will still sit.
It's interesting because I think, Debbie, you and I were talking before we hit record, and we were just talking about, listen, the residents, if you're an investor, if you're a rental investor here, or from what I'm hearing from you, Christine, if you want to come and flip houses, these people are going to be very particular. They're not going to take trash.
Tenants are too.
All right. That's what I mean. The residents are going to be very particular in what they move into. Now there's a high demand, but if your property's a good property, then if it's subpar, it might sit for a little bit.
Yeah. I would say even a tenant, even to owner, they're savvy and they're educating themselves, and they're coming in loaded. So you have to be prepared, and you've got to be able to give a quality product, because it is very savvy here. Yeah.
Well, this has been great. What I'd love to do is I'd love to have you all back. We'll have Gray Hall back on here. What I'd like to do is potentially maybe even walk through a deal. We don't have to disclose, like, we don't have to talk about the address or anything. We can just talk about the area. Maybe Christine, a deal that you've done with an investor that like we've rented, or Debbie that you've helped. And I'd love to like help, like walk our listeners through one of these deals and just let them see what it's like.
Absolutely.
Oh, we'd love that.
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thank y'all for being on the show. I do want to mention before we go that you two, plus we have Chris Reagan, another team member of ours. The three of you are starting your own podcast. So why don't you tell our listeners what this podcast is going to be about?
I'll let you take that away, Debbie.
We're super excited to announce the podcast for the Denver market. It's going to be called Pinot and Property Management.
Nice.
And a lot of it's, we want to have a funny take on property management because we all know a lot happens in this industry, and kind of tell you stories of things that happen because you can't make some of the stuff up. And then of course, what we learned from it and why it's important to know the market.
Awesome. So this is going to be a perfect podcast for anybody who owns rentals in the Denver market. Maybe you're one of those accidental landlords and you're thinking, well, do I can manage it? Or maybe I need a property manager. Not really sure, but listen in. Pinot and Property Management. Is that right? Did I get that right?
That's it.
Okay. So they're starting to record the episodes, and we'll let you know on our podcast when it's finally released and out there. Awesome, ladies.
We're excited.
Well, thank y'all for being here. And if you haven't already, leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. And we'll be back next week with another episode of the Evernest Real Estate Investor Podcast.